In the quiet suburb of Willow Creek, the streets were lined with old trees that swayed gently with the wind, and the houses were neatly arranged with well-kept gardens and white fences that looked like something out of a postcard. It was in this idyllic setting that Emily Johnson, a 38-year-old woman, lived with her teenage daughter, Sophie. On the surface, their routine seemed serene, but inside the Johnson home, the atmosphere was quite different. Emily, married for 2 years to David, a 42-year-old man, felt that something was constantly out of place. The relationship between David and Sophie, her 16-year-old daughter, had never been harmonious. From the beginning, Sophie had resisted accepting the stepfather figure, and each day, the tensions between them grew more apparent. Emily watched the situation with a heavy heart. She tried in every way to mediate the conflicts that arose almost daily, but she knew the situation was becoming increasingly complicated. David was a man of rigid principles who firmly believed in discipline and respect for rules. On the other hand, Sophie, with the rebellious spirit typical of adolescence, saw David's actions as an attempt to control her, which only fueled her resistance. On the morning before a business trip that would take her away from home for a few days, Emily decided to have a serious conversation with Sophie. The kitchen was silent, except for the sound of coffee bubbling in the coffee maker. The morning sun lit up the space, but the atmosphere was heavy with tension. "Sophie, we need to talk," Emily began, sitting at the wooden table already marked by time. I know you and David have your differences, but this can't go on like this. We are a family." Sophie, with her arms crossed and her face tense, avoided her mother's gaze. "Mom, he's not my father. He never will be. He's so authoritarian. He doesn't care what I think or feel. He just wants me to follow his rules." Emily sighed deeply, feeling a mix of sadness and frustration. "I understand that he has a different way of seeing things, but he cares about you, Sophie. He just wants what's best." Sophie finally looked up, her eyes full of a mixture of hurt and anger. "If he cared, he'd listen to what I have to say, but he never does. It's always his way. I feel suffocated here." Emily felt a pang in her heart hearing her daughter's words. She knew Sophie had a point, but she also understood that David, with all his rigidity, wasn't a bad man. "I just want you two to get along. This is affecting all of us." Sophie bit her lower lip, hesitating before responding. "Mom, you don't understand. He doesn't even try. And when you're not here, things get even worse." Those words hit Emily like a stone. The idea that tensions could escalate in her absence was something she hadn't deeply considered until that moment. Her concern for her daughter mixed with a sense of responsibility. She needed to find out what was really happening when she wasn't around. "I need you to trust me, Sophie. I'll find a way to make this better," Emily said, trying to lift the tone of her voice, more to convince herself than her daughter. Determined to protect Sophie and understand the family dynamics that unfolded in her absence, Emily made a decision she had never imagined. A few hours later, while packing her bags for the trip, she discreetly installed a hidden camera in the living room. It would be her invisible eye, the only way to monitor what happened between Sophie and David while she was away. Emily knew this could bring difficult truths to light, but she was willing to face whatever came her way, hoping to finally bring peace to her home. Emily left for a conference in another city, leaving Sophie and David alone in the quiet house. The atmosphere between them had already been tense, but now, without Emily around to mediate their interactions, the tension felt even more palpable. Sophie, with her teenage spirit full of conflicting emotions, decided that the best course of action was to isolate herself. Avoiding David seemed like the only viable strategy to endure those days without her mother. She knew that any small disagreement could escalate into a bigger argument, something she wasn't willing to face. David, on the other hand, was completely unaware of the camera Emily had installed before leaving. The camera was hidden in a discreet corner of the living room, silently capturing every moment. David continued with his usual routine, oblivious to the fact that every move and every word spoken was being recorded. To him, it was just another ordinary day marked by the same rituals he followed with precision. Sophie, however, did not feel comfortable in her own home. She spent most of her time locked in her room, a space that had become her personal refuge. There, among the walls painted a soft blue and posters of bands she liked, she sought some form of peace. Her daily activities were reduced to listening to loud music through her headphones, sketching in her notebook, or texting friends on her phone, anything to keep her occupied and away from David. The only sound that broke the barrier of Sophie's isolation was the occasional noise of footsteps in the hallway or the sound of the TV coming from the living room, where David watched his favorite shows. He didn't seem bothered by his stepdaughter's absence from the common areas of the house, but he also made no effort to seek her out. To him, the silence that hung over the house was a sign that things were under control. Occasionally, Sophie would hear David knock on her bedroom door, his voice muffled by the music. "Sophie, do you want dinner?" "I'm making pasta," he would ask in a tone that tried to be friendly but sounded distant to her. Sophie hesitated, briefly considering the possibility of coming out, but she always ended up responding with some excuse. "I'm not hungry," she'd say, trying to keep her voice steady. Without pressing the issue, David would return to the kitchen, where he prepared the meal for himself. He thought the distance between him and Sophie was just a phase, something that would improve over time. But Sophie, behind closed doors, felt the opposite. Each passing day seemed to strengthen the invisible barrier she had built between them. At night, as the house plunged into an almost oppressive silence, Sophie stayed awake, staring at the ceiling of her room, her mind filled with confused thoughts and contradictory feelings. She wished her mother were there to break the ice, to bring back the sense of normalcy she longed for. David, after watching TV late into the night, would turn off the lights and head upstairs to the bedroom he shared with Emily. He would pass by Sophie's closed door, hesitating for a brief moment, but would then move on, thinking that perhaps, with Emily's return, things would get back to normal. And so the days dragged on, with Sophie and David moving around the house like strangers, each lost in their own thoughts, waiting for Emily's return to dissipate the tension that seemed to have become part of the air they breathed. After a week away, Emily returned home, carrying her luggage and the weight of the concern that had accumulated during her absence. She barely crossed the threshold before sensing that the atmosphere was heavy, as if the house was hiding secrets she urgently needed to uncover. The longing for Sophie tightened her chest, but something deeper unsettled her. Without wasting time, she went straight to the office, where she had stored the laptop used to access the hidden camera footage. Seated at the desk, Emily felt her hands tremble as she opened the computer and began to play the recorded videos. The screen lit up with scenes of her home, familiar yet now causing her anxiety. With every passing second, her heart raced, fearing she would uncover something she couldn't unsee. The first recording showed David in the living room, sitting on the sofa with a serious expression, as if reflecting on something important. Soon, Sophie appeared on the screen, rushing through the room with her headphones on and a closed expression. Emily leaned in closer to the screen, trying to absorb every detail. David called Sophie, his voice calm but carrying a seriousness Emily didn't recognize. "Sophie, can I talk to you for a minute?" David asked, his eyes fixed on his stepdaughter. Sophie stopped, hesitating for a second before taking off her headphones and turning to him, clearly suspicious. "What is it now, David?" she asked, her voice laden with frustration. David took a deep breath, as if carefully choosing his words. "I know things between us haven't been easy. I just want to understand what's going on with you. I want to help." Emily watched the scene, surprised by the patience David displayed. He seemed genuinely interested in listening to Sophie, something she had never witnessed before. Sophie, on the other hand, maintained a defensive stance, arms crossed over her chest, but there was a weakness in her eyes, as if she was struggling against the urge to open up. "You want to help me? How, David? You don't even know me. You just impose rules and expect me to obey," Sophie replied, her voice filled with hurt. David did not back down. "I know I've made mistakes, but I want to try to improve. I want to be someone you can trust, someone you can rely on." Emily felt a mix of relief and confusion as she saw the sincerity on David's face. The man in the recording seemed different from the husband she knew, the one who rarely showed emotion or engaged in deep conversations. David continued, offering advice to Sophie, talking about the importance of communication and trust. He spoke with a level of understanding and sensitivity Emily had never seen in him, as if he was genuinely trying to build a bridge between them. However, as Emily watched more recordings, something began to trouble her. There was something strange about David's behavior, something she couldn't quite identify. Sometimes, during the conversations, he seemed distant, as if his words were rehearsed or as if he was trying to follow an invisible script. The way he looked at Sophie, his tone of voice, the deliberate pauses, all seemed slightly off, as if he were playing a role that wasn't entirely his own. Emily watched every second of the footage, her mind spinning around the growing sense of unease. David seemed to be trying to do the right thing, but there was a subtle, almost imperceptible disconnection that left Emily unsettled. She didn't know if this was due to her own exhaustion or if there was something deeper, something still to be revealed. Whatever it was, Emily knew she couldn't ignore what she was feeling. Determined to understand what was really happening, Emily decided to investigate further. In the following days, whenever she had a free moment, she sat in front of the laptop, diving deeper into the recordings captured by the hidden camera. At first, there seemed to be nothing out of the ordinary. David followed his usual routine, preparing breakfast, reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, watching TV in the late afternoon. But as the hours of footage progressed, Emily began to notice a disturbing pattern in her husband's behavior. There were moments when David seemed to disconnect from the reality around him. He would stop in the middle of a task, like washing dishes or setting the table, and stand still for several minutes, his eyes fixed on something Emily couldn't see. When he finally moved again, it was as if he had forgotten what he was doing, and his gaze carried a strange mix of confusion and distress. But what caught Emily's attention most was the way David began to act concerning an old photograph that was framed in the living room. The photo, taken years ago, showed David and Emily embracing, smiling at the camera on a sunny day. It was one of Emily's favorite memories, a symbol of the beginning of their relationship. However, in the recordings, David seemed fascinated by this image in a way Emily had never witnessed before. He would spend long minutes standing in front of the photo, his eyes fixed on the smiling faces. Sometimes he whispered words that the camera couldn't capture clearly, but Emily could see his lips moving, as if having a silent conversation with the photograph. At other times, David would take the frame in his hands, holding it carefully as if it were something precious and fragile. He would study the image, his gaze intense and penetrating, and then, without warning, his expression would change. A look of sadness, almost despair, would appear in his eyes, and he would press the photo against his chest, as if seeking some kind of comfort that it could not provide. David's behavior became increasingly unsettling. In certain recordings, he seemed to talk to himself, murmuring words that sounded like fragments of incomplete thoughts. He walked through the house, running his fingers along the walls as if trying to remember something long forgotten. Emily, watching all of this, felt a shiver run down her spine. It wasn't just that David was acting strangely, it was the sense that he was battling something internal, something he couldn't explain even to himself. As she continued reviewing the footage, Emily found herself increasingly perplexed. The scenes were disjointed, almost surreal, as if David were trapped in a parallel reality that only he could see. In one of the videos, he abruptly stopped in the middle of the room and began speaking aloud, as if responding to an invisible presence. His words were fragmented, and Emily couldn't understand what he was saying, but the tone of his voice was disturbingly desperate. David seemed to be losing himself in his own thoughts, and the way he looked at that photograph, as if it held answers to questions he didn't even know to ask, left Emily with an unsettling feeling she couldn't shake off. Emily could no longer bear the weight of the doubts that had haunted her since watching the recordings. She knew she needed to confront David, even though the prospect of a difficult conversation made her anxious. She decided that the right moment would be during dinner, when they would be together, with no distractions, and the calmer environment might facilitate the discussion. That night, the table was set as usual, but the air seemed charged with an invisible tension. Emily could barely taste the food in front of her. The sound of the utensils clinking on the plates seemed louder than usual, as if every small noise was amplifying the unease she felt. David, on the other hand, was quieter than usual, his eyes fixed on his plate, moving the food around but eating little. Emily decided she could no longer postpone. She took a deep breath, trying to control her nervousness, and finally broke the silence. "David," she began, her voice firm but gentle, "we need to talk about something." David looked up, surprised by his wife's serious tone. "Sure, what is it?" He tried to appear nonchalant, but the slight tension in his eyes betrayed his discomfort. Emily hesitated for a moment, but she knew she couldn't back down. "I've been watching the recordings from the camera I set up in the living room. I saw you spending a lot of time looking at that photo of us." David's expression changed immediately. He frowned, puzzled, and replied, trying to keep his voice neutral, "Emily, why are you snooping through my things? I didn't know there was a camera here. I set up the camera to better understand what was happening between you and Sophie," Emily explained, trying to remain calm. "But what I saw was you acting strangely." "What's going on, David?" Why are you so obsessed with that photo? David put down his utensils, clearly disturbed by the direction of the conversation. He looked away, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. Emily, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not obsessed with anything. You're exaggerating. Exaggerating? Emily repeated, her voice rising slightly. I saw you talking to yourself, holding that photo as if it were the only thing keeping you here. David, I want to understand what's happening. Why can't you just tell me? David ran a hand over his face as if trying to wipe away the frustration building inside him. Emily, I don't want to talk about it. It's just a photo. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything? Emily's voice grew sharper, filled with disbelief. David, don't lie to me. I saw the way you looked at it, as if you were searching for answers. What are you hiding? David finally looked up, anger and discomfort visible on his face. I'm not hiding anything, he retorted, his voice firm but laden with emotion. You think you understand, but you don't understand anything. You have no idea what's going on with me. Emily was silent for a moment, taken aback by the intensity of David's response. Then help me understand, she pleaded, her voice softer, almost begging. I just want to know what's troubling you so much. David shook his head, his frustration turning into desperation. Emily, please just stop with this. I can't talk about it. It's complicated. You won't understand. The conversation that Emily had hoped would provide answers ended in a heated argument, with David defending himself at every new question, while Emily felt even more confused. She realized that despite her efforts, she was further from the truth than ever, and the barrier between them now seemed more insurmountable than before. The following night, after another day trying to understand what was going on with David, Emily felt she needed a different perspective. She knew Sophie had a different view of her stepfather and might be able to help piece together the emotional puzzle. So she waited until the house was quiet and went to Sophie's room, knocking gently on the door. Sophie, can I come in? Emily asked, trying to mask the worry in her voice. Sophie, lying on her bed and scrolling through her phone, looked up at her mother with a hint of suspicion. Sure, come in. Emily entered, closing the door behind her, and sat on the edge of the bed, unsure of how to start. Hey. I wanted to talk to you about David, she began, trying to keep her voice calm. I've seen some things that worry me. Sophie furrowed her brow, already feeling the discomfort that such conversations brought. What did you see? Emily hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I saw him acting differently, as if he were dealing with something very difficult. He seems so distant, so lost sometimes. And I don't know what to do to help him. Sophie was silent for a few moments, her eyes reflecting the internal struggle between her newfound loyalty to her stepfather and her desire to be honest with her mother. Finally she sighed and sat up on the bed, crossing her legs. Mom, David told me a secret, something I didn't expect to hear. Emily's heart quickened. What did he tell you, Sophie? Sophie bit her lip, clearly reluctant to share but realizing she had no choice. He said that when he was younger, he went through something really bad, something traumatic. He didn't go into details, but he said it still haunts him. That's why he sometimes acts strange, distant. He's always trying to keep everything under control, but I think sometimes he just can't. Emily absorbed the words, trying to process what this meant. And you, Sophie? How did you feel about that? Sophie looked at the floor, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the bedspread. At first I didn't know what to think. I thought he might be trying to manipulate me, you know? But then I saw him cry. Emily was taken aback. Et David? Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with an empathy Emily had not noticed before. Yes, several times. I'd never seen him cry before, never thought he could. He was alone in the living room, thinking no one was watching, and he just broke down. That's when I realized he was really struggling with something serious. Emily felt a wave of sadness and understanding begin to form inside her. That changes everything, doesn't it? She asked, more to herself than to Sophie. Sophie looked at her mother with an expression that mixed uncertainty and maturity. I think so, Mom. It's not easy, but I think he's trying. Emily remained silent, letting Sophie's words echo in her mind. She had never imagined David as someone who could carry such deep pain, and Sophie's revelation seemed to open a new door to an understanding that had previously seemed out of reach. Emily spent the rest of the night awake, reflecting on Sophie's revelation. Her daughter's words echoed in her mind, and for the first time, she began to see David in a new light. The image of the distant and mysterious man started to transform into someone deeply marked by a painful past, someone who might need more help than she had realized. Sitting in the armchair in the living room as the house descended into the silence of the early morning, Emily knew she couldn't ignore what she had discovered. Sophie was beginning to see her stepfather differently, and Emily felt that she too needed to make the same shift in perspective. She decided it was time to give David a genuine chance, but to do so she needed to understand better what was going on with him and how she could help. In the following days, Emily began to observe David more closely, trying to catch signals that might have gone unnoticed before. She noticed the small changes in his behavior, the way he avoided certain topics of conversation, the way his eyes wandered into distant thoughts, and even the slight tremor in his hands when he thought no one was looking. Each detail seemed to confirm that he was carrying an invisible burden, something that shaped the way he interacted with the world and those around him. Determined to help, Emily started researching past traumas and how they could affect a person years after the traumatic event. She spent hours reading articles, watching videos, and trying to understand the complexities of what David might be facing. She discovered that old traumas could leave deep scars, often invisible, but capable of influencing every aspect of someone's life. And more than that, she learned that dealing with these scars required patience, understanding, and, above all, support. Emily also began looking for practical ways to help David confront his past. She thought about suggesting therapy but knew she needed to find the right moment to bring up the subject. She also considered the possibility of more open and honest conversations where he could feel safe sharing his feelings and fears. However, she knew she had to be careful. Pressuring David could push him further away. Meanwhile, Sophie, who had once viewed David as a distant and almost adversarial figure, began to see him differently. The words he had shared with her and the tears he had tried to hide planted a seed of empathy in her heart. She started observing him with less judgment and more curiosity, trying to understand what lay behind that rigid facade. Sometimes she found herself thinking about how it must be to carry such a heavy burden and how she, a teenager still discovering the world, could contribute to lightening that load. Emily noticed this change in Sophie and felt a mix of relief and hope. Perhaps together they could help David find a way to heal his wounds or at least carry his burden with less pain. The relationship between them, which had once seemed marked only by conflicts and distance, now had a chance to transform into something deeper, something built on understanding and solidarity. On a night when the rain was falling heavily, drumming against the windows of the house, Emily and Sophie were sitting on the living room couch, immersed in a serious conversation. The soft light from the lamp illuminated their faces, reflecting the intensity of the moment. They were once again discussing David's behavior, trying to piece together what he might be facing. "I can't stop thinking about what he told you," Emily murmured, running her fingers through her hair, clearly troubled. "If he's carrying something this heavy, we need to help him." Sophie nodded, her expression mirroring the same concern. "I know, Mom. But I think he's afraid to open up completely. Maybe he thinks we won't understand." In the midst of their conversation, the front door opened silently. David, drenched from the rain, came in earlier than expected, shaking off his umbrella before closing it. He paused for a moment upon hearing Emily and Sophie's voices. His steps became slower as he approached the living room, realizing that his arrival had gone unnoticed. "What are you talking about?" David asked, his deep voice cutting through the air, startling both Emily and Sophie. They turned quickly, surprised to see him there. David!" Emily exclaimed, trying to hide her nervousness. "We were talking about you." David frowned, noticing that the tone of their voices and the exchanged glances suggested there was more to the conversation than he was being told. "About me? What exactly?" Emily exchanged a look with Sophie before getting up and walking toward David. "We were talking about what you told Sophie. About what happened in your past." David remained silent for a few seconds, his eyes fixed on the floor as if weighing his next words. The rain outside seemed to intensify, creating a curtain of sound that filled the space between them. Finally, he sighed deeply, as if about to bear a burden he had carried for a long time. Maybe it's time I tell you everything," David said, his voice now lower, laden with contained emotion. "You deserve to know." He moved to the center of the room, feeling the intensity of Emily and Sophie's gazes on him. He sat in a nearby chair and rubbed his hands as if seeking courage in the words that were about to come. "Years ago, I lost someone who was very important to me. It was more than just a loved one, it was someone I considered a part of myself. It was an accident, something I never really got over. I was there, and watching that life slip away before my eyes was devastating." Emily moved closer, feeling the pain in David's words. "Who was it, David?" He looked up, the emotional scars seeming to surface on his face. "It was my brother. We were very close, almost inseparable. That day changed everything for me. Since then, I haven't been the same." Sophie, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke, her voice soft but filled with understanding. "Is that why you act so reserved? Is that why it seems like you're always holding something back?" David nodded, a deep sadness in his eyes. "Yes. I shut myself off from the world, thinking it was the only way to cope with the pain. And without realizing it, I started pushing everyone away, even you, Sophie." Emily placed her hand over his, her touch gentle but full of support. "David, you don't have to carry this alone anymore. We're here with you." David looked at them, feeling a mixture of relief and vulnerability. Emily and Sophie's words resonated in his mind, and he realized that, for the first time in many years, he might not need to hide his scars anymore. With the truth finally exposed, Emily's home felt suspended in a state of uncertainty. Every conversation, every exchanged glance between the three of them seemed charged with a new and uncomfortable tension. David, now more vulnerable than ever, was trying to find a footing in the whirlwind of emotions that had been triggered. Emily and Sophie, in turn, struggled to adjust their perspectives, but the path to reconciliation seemed fraught with invisible obstacles. On a cloudy morning, as a fine rain fell outside, Emily was in the kitchen making coffee, trying to focus on something simple and everyday to calm her mind. She couldn't shake the weight of guilt she felt for not realizing earlier what David had been going through. Sophie entered the kitchen, her shoulders slumped as if she were carrying a heavy burden. She grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, her eyes avoiding her mother's. The silence between them was dense until Sophie finally broke it. "Mom, why didn't he tell me before? Why did he hide this from me?" Sophie asked, her voice laden with hurt. "I feel betrayed. Like he never trusted me." Emily stopped stirring the coffee and looked at her daughter, realizing the depth of the pain in her words. "Sophie, I think he was scared. Scared of being judged, of being seen differently. He's been carrying this burden alone for so long that he might not have known how to share it, even with the people he loves." Sophie clutched the cup between her hands, feeling frustration bubble inside her. "But I'm part of this family. He should have trusted me. Now it feels like our entire relationship was based on something he kept hidden." Emily sighed and sat down beside her daughter, searching for the right words. "I understand how you feel. I feel guilty too, for not realizing sooner, for not seeing how much he was suffering. But Sophie, dealing with trauma like this, it's not simple. David didn't want to hurt us, but he was trapped in his own pain." Sophie looked at her mother, seeking some form of solace. "And now? What do we do with all of this?" Emily held her daughter's hand, her touch comforting and filled with understanding. "And now we try to understand, Sophie. We try to forgive and move forward, even though it's hard. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think if we're willing to take that step, we can find a new path together." At that moment, David entered the kitchen, his face marked by exhaustion and uncertainty. He paused upon seeing Emily and Sophie holding hands, the tension between them almost palpable. "Hey, I heard you talking," he began, his voice hesitant. "And I know I've made many mistakes. I should have been more honest from the start. I didn't want you to feel betrayed or pushed away. I just didn't know how to handle all of this. And in the end, I ended up hurting both of you." Sophie looked at her stepfather, her expression a mix of pain and empathy. "David, I don't understand everything you've been through, but I want to try. It's just going to take time." Emily nodded, looking at David with a mix of sadness and determination. "We all need time, David. But we need to do this together if we want this family to work." David moved closer, feeling the vulnerability of the situation but also a glimmer of hope. I'm willing to try. I know I've made mistakes, but I want to do whatever it takes to fix this. The silence that followed was no longer an impassable chasm but a space where the possibility of rebuilding began to take shape. They all knew the road ahead would be difficult and filled with uncertainties, but in that moment, united in the kitchen, there was a mutual recognition that perhaps it was possible to find a new balance, a new beginning. David made the decision to seek professional help to deal with his trauma, a step he had avoided for a long time. With Emily's help, he found a therapist specialized in trauma and began attending sessions regularly. With each visit, David opened up a bit more, trying to confront and process the pain he had carried for so many years. He spoke about the accident that had taken his brother and the profound impact it had on his life, his conversations filled with emotion and painful revelations. Meanwhile, the dynamics in the house started to change. Sophie and David, who had barely spoken without arguing before, began to spend more time together. David made a conscious effort to reach out to Sophie, helping her with daily tasks and trying to engage more in her interests. One Saturday afternoon, David offered to help Sophie with a school project. He sat at the kitchen table, watching as she worked on a history report. "How's it going with this?" David asked, trying to sound interested, though visibly nervous. Sophie looked at him, a bit surprised by the gesture. "It's going well. I just need to finish this part on the French Revolution." David leaned in to look at the report. "Can I help with that? I studied quite a bit of history when I was younger." Sophie hesitated, but then smiled slightly. "Sure. I really don't understand much about this part." They spent the afternoon discussing historical facts and, during the process, talked about other topics as well. David began to share stories about his own life, trying to build a genuine connection with Sophie. Although the conversations were often uncertain and shy, it was a start. Emily watched from a distance, sitting on the living room sofa with a hopeful expression. She saw how the interactions between David and Sophie were becoming smoother, how the ice between them was beginning to thaw, albeit slowly. There were moments when they laughed together or shared understanding glances that had seemed impossible before. Emily felt a sense of relief seeing these small changes, a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel suggesting that things could improve over time. Despite the progress, there was still a sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that something significant was about to happen. Emily felt that, while they were on the right path, there were more challenges ahead, something that might still be not fully understood. The family was doing its best to come together and address their issues, but the future seemed laden with uncertainties and promises of new discoveries and growth. On a tranquil evening, when the house was immersed in a gentle silence, Emily and David found themselves in the living room, discussing the progress of the past few weeks. The tension between them had eased somewhat, and their conversation flowed more naturally, though the weight of the past still lingered in the air. David was sitting in the armchair by the window, looking at an old box that lay open on the table. He had discovered the object in a forgotten corner of the attic and examined it with a mixture of nostalgia and confusion. Emily, curious about what he was doing, approached him. "David, what's in this box?" Emily asked, leaning in to take a look. "Did you just find it?" David looked up, visibly disturbed. "Yes, I found it in the attic. I thought it would just be a bunch of old keepsakes, but there are things here that surprised me." Emily sat down next to him and watched as he sifted through the box. There were yellowed letters and faded photographs that seemed to carry untold stories. David pulled out a photo and held it delicately between his fingers, gazing at it thoughtfully. "A look at this," David said, handing the photo to Emily. "Do you recognize this woman?" Emily took the photo and looked at the woman in the image. She looked familiar, with features that vaguely resembled her own. "She looks like me, but that's impossible. Who is she?" David sighed deeply, his face reflecting a mix of surprise and concern. "I wasn't sure at first, but upon closer inspection I realized that the woman in the photo is someone I knew many years ago. She was very close to you." Emily raised her eyebrows, confused. "Close to me? I don't know anyone who looks like her." David hesitated before speaking, his voice low and filled with emotion. "She was a close friend of your family. In fact, I was involved with her before I met you. Her name was Clara. She was an incredible person, but the relationship didn't work out. I never imagined I'd have a connection with you like this." Emily looked at David, her mind spinning with the new information. Clara. I've heard that name before. I think my mother mentioned a Clara when I was little, but I never understood much about it. David nodded, clearly uncomfortable. Yes, that was her. And seeing these photos and letters now, I feel like there's something deeper here. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but it seems like fate is trying to show us something. Emily leaned back in her chair, feeling the unexpected connection. So you and her? David interrupted, his voice filled with regret. It was a complicated relationship. I loved her, but things didn't work out. And now seeing you and knowing that Clara was a part of your life, I feel like there's a link we need to understand better. Emily took a deep breath, processing the revelation. This is really surprising. I never imagined there would be such a direct connection between our past and our present. David looked at her with a sincere expression. And neither did I, but maybe this discovery can help us understand better what we're going through now. Maybe it's a sign that we should explore this connection, both for our own understanding and for our family. The room fell silent as the two of them contemplated the meaning of the revelation. The photo and letters, a window into an unexpected past, now seemed to illuminate a new dimension of David and Emily's lives, revealing an unknown link that intertwined with their present.